In the sweltering Louisiana heat of August 1860, 7 enslaved women stood in a line outside the overseer's cabin on Belmont Plantation, each one visibly pregnant, each one carrying a child they had not chosen to conceive. Their master, Pierre Beaumont, a 45-year-old plantation owner who controlled 1,500 acres and 32 enslaved people, had systematically raped every woman of childbearing age on his property over the past year. Now, as summer reached its peak and the cotton fields stretched white with harvest-ready bolls, all 7 women were pregnant simultaneously, their bodies swollen with children who would be born into slavery, who would increase Beaumont's wealth, who were the products of violence he called his right as a master. The women stood together in silent solidarity, understanding without speaking that they shared a trauma none of them had been able to prevent, that their pregnancies were visible evidence of their master's systematic sexual violence, that they were about to give birth to children who would be both their own and constant reminders of rape. This is not a story with heroes or happy endings. This is a story about the sexual violence that was built into American slavery, about how one man used his power to brutalize 7 women, about the children born from rape and the communities that had to survive such horror. Before we dive into the specific nightmare that was Belmont Plantation in 1860, we need to understand the broader context that made Pierre Beaumont's systematic rape of his enslaved women possible and essentially legal. Sexual violence against enslaved women was not an aberration or exception in the slavery system. It was fundamental to how slavery operated, how it reproduced itself, how it maintained white supremacy. Enslaved women had no legal protection against rape by anyone, white or black. Masters who raped their enslaved women faced no criminal charges, no social consequences in most cases, no punishment of any kind. The children born from these rapes were automatically enslaved. Following the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum, children inherit the status of their mother, which meant every rape that resulted in pregnancy increased the master's wealth through the creation of new enslaved people. This system incentivized sexual violence, turned rape into profitable behavior, made enslaved women's bodies into sites of both sexual exploitation and forced reproduction. Pierre Beaumont was born in 1815 to a wealthy Louisiana Creole family that had made its fortune in sugar and cotton. He inherited Belmont Plantation from his father in 1845 and had been running it for 15 years by 1860. Beaumont was not married, had never married, showed no interest in white women as potential wives. He claimed he was too focused on business for marriage, that he didn't want the complications of a wife interfering with how he ran his plantation. But the real reason, as became clear over time, was that Beaumont preferred having absolute power over the women he had sexual access to, and marriage to a white woman would have constrained that power in ways he found unacceptable. As an unmarried master with no white woman on the plantation to observe or restrain his behavior, Beaumont had near-total freedom to sexually exploit the enslaved women he owned. The 7 women who were all pregnant in the summer of 1860 ranged in age from 18 to 34. Their names were Marie, Josephine, Claire, Estelle, Adeline, Celeste, and Pauline. Each had her own story, her own life before Beaumont began systematically raping them, her own dreams and hopes that slavery had already limited, but that sexual violence would damage further. Marie was 18, the youngest, recently elevated from field work to housework, her youth and beauty making her a target. Josephine was 22, married to an enslaved man named Thomas, trying to maintain her marriage while being repeatedly raped by her master. Claire was 25, with 2 young children from previous forced pregnancies, exhausted and depressed from years of sexual exploitation. Estelle was 27, strong-willed and defiant in subtle ways that hadn't yet gotten her killed. Adeline was 29, quiet and withdrawn, having learned that invisibility was the best protection she could manage. Celeste was 32, the oldest of the currently childbearing women, a cook who had been on Belmont since childhood. Pauline was 34, recently brought to Belmont from a neighboring plantation that had been liquidated, still trying to understand her new circumstances when Beaumont began raping her. Beaumont's systematic sexual violence began in earnest in late 1859. He had always sexually exploited some of the enslaved women on Belmont, but in the fall of 1859, he adopted a new approach that was more organized and deliberate. He decided he would impregnate every woman of childbearing age on his plantation within a short period, creating what he thought of as a breeding program that would substantially increase his enslaved workforce over the next generation. This wasn't random or opportunistic violence, but calculated and systematic, a business decision as much as an expression of his sexual desires and his power. Beaumont began with Marie, the youngest and newest to housework. He summoned her to his private chambers one evening in October 1859, and when she arrived, he raped her. Marie had been warned by older women that this might happen, had been told that refusing a master's advances could mean death, had been advised to submit and survive. But nothing could have prepared her for the actual experience, for the violence and pain and humiliation, for the psychological shock of being used as an object by the person who owned her. When it was over, Beaumont told Marie she would come when summoned, that this would continue, that she should tell no one. Marie stumbled back to the slave quarters, found a corner where she could cry alone, tried to process what had happened to her. Over the following weeks, Beaumont summoned Marie repeatedly. She would be called to his chambers several times a week, would be raped, would be sent away until the next summons. Marie tried to dissociate during these encounters, tried to separate her mind from her body, tried to survive by not being fully present. But the trauma accumulated, the psychological damage deepened, and Marie became increasingly withdrawn and depressed. The other women on the plantation noticed the change in her, understood what must be happening even though Marie said nothing, tried to support her in small ways that wouldn't draw Beaumont's attention or punishment. In November, Beaumont expanded his systematic violence to include Josephine. Josephine was married to Thomas, a field worker, and they had been trying to have children without success. When Beaumont began summoning Josephine, she told him about her marriage, begged him to leave her alone so she could be faithful to her husband. Beaumont laughed at her pleading, told her that her marriage meant nothing, that she belonged to him, and he would use her as he chose. Josephine's rape by Beaumont destroyed her marriage in ways that couldn't be repaired. Thomas knew what was happening, knew his wife was being raped regularly, knew there was nothing he could do to protect her. The helplessness and humiliation destroyed Thomas psychologically, made him withdraw from Josephine emotionally, even though he understood intellectually that none of this was her fault. Beaumont continued adding women to his rotation of systematic rape throughout the winter of 1859-1860. By March 1860, he was regularly summoning all 7 women, creating a schedule that ensured each would be raped multiple times per week. The women began to realize that they were all being subjected to the same violence, that Beaumont was systematically working through every woman of childbearing age on the plantation. They began to talk among themselves, sharing their experiences, supporting each other, creating a community of shared trauma that helped them survive even though it couldn't stop the violence. These conversations among the women were necessary for survival, but also dangerous. They had to be careful, had to speak only in private moments when overseers weren't present, had to use coded language that wouldn't expose them if they were overheard. They shared practical information about how to manage the physical pain and injuries from rape, about herbs that might help with infections or unwanted pregnancies, about psychological strategies for surviving the trauma. They validated each other's experiences, assured each other that the shame belonged to Beaumont, not to them, reminded each other that they were human beings, deserving of dignity, even though they were being treated as objects. The pregnancies began to become visible in the spring of 1860. Marie was first, her pregnancy detected in March when she began experiencing morning sickness that made her unable to work effectively some mornings. Then Josephine, Claire, Estelle, Adeline, Celeste, and Pauline all became pregnant in quick succession as Beaumont's systematic rapes continued. By June, all 7 women were visibly pregnant, their bellies swelling with children conceived through rape, their bodies visible evidence of Beaumont's systematic sexual violence. The enslaved community on Belmont understood exactly what had happened, knew that Beaumont had deliberately impregnated all 7 women, recognized this as a calculated act of violence and exploitation. The men who were married to or partnered with some of these women faced their own trauma and rage. Thomas, Josephine's husband, watched his wife carry Beaumont's child and felt helpless fury that he could do nothing to protect her or prevent this. Etienne, who had been partnered with Claire, had to watch her go through yet another forced pregnancy while their own children lived in slavery. The men felt emasculated and powerless, unable to fulfill what they understood as their responsibilities to protect their families, forced to witness their wives and partners being violated repeatedly while having no ability to stop it. The women tried to maintain their relationships with their partners despite the trauma and strain. Josephine tried to explain to Thomas that the rape wasn't her fault, that she hadn't wanted any of this, that she still loved him and wanted their marriage to survive. But Thomas struggled to be intimate with his wife while she was pregnant with another man's child, couldn't look at her swelling belly without feeling rage and shame, withdrew emotionally in ways that hurt Josephine even as she understood why he was reacting this way. Their marriage, which had been strong before Beaumont's violence, became strained nearly to breaking under the weight of trauma neither of them had caused, but both had to endure. The pregnancies also created practical complications for plantation operations. Pregnant women couldn't work as hard or as long as non-pregnant women, needed rest and lighter duties as their pregnancies progressed, required adjustments to work assignments. But Beaumont, having deliberately created 7 simultaneous pregnancies, was annoyed by these complications. He complained that his breeding program was interfering with productivity, that the women were using their pregnancies as excuses to shirk work, that they needed to push through and maintain their labor despite being pregnant. This cruel indifference to the physical toll of pregnancy, especially pregnancy resulting from his own rapes, demonstrated Beaumont's complete lack of empathy or recognition of the women's humanity. The house servants who weren't pregnant, the older women past childbearing age, and the younger girls not yet at childbearing age, watched the 7 pregnant women with horror and sympathy. They knew they were witnessing systematic sexual violence on a scale that was shocking even within the brutal context of slavery. They tried to help the pregnant women when they could, taking on extra work to ease their burdens, bringing them food and herbs, offering emotional support and solidarity. But they also lived with fear, knowing that the younger girls would eventually reach childbearing age and would likely face the same systematic rape, knowing that Beaumont's violence wasn't stopping but was becoming a permanent feature of life on Belmont. The older women, who had survived their own decades of sexual exploitation and forced pregnancies, played a particular role in supporting the 7 currently pregnant women. They had knowledge about managing pregnancy and childbirth, about herbs and practices that could ease pain or complications, about psychological strategies for enduring unbearable circumstances. They became informal midwives and counselors, helping the pregnant women prepare for births that none of them wanted, but all of them would have to survive. These older women carried their own trauma from years of sexual violence, saw in the current situation a continuation of the horror they had experienced, felt both sympathy for the younger women and exhaustion from decades of witnessing and surviving such brutality. The births began in late summer 1860. Marie gave birth first in August, to a baby girl who showed obvious mixed-race features, light brown skin and hair texture that suggested European ancestry. Marie looked at her daughter with complicated emotions, loving this child because it was hers, but also being reminded every time she looked at her of the rape that had created her. She named the baby Amélie, a beautiful name for a child born from horror, and tried to focus on the innocent new life rather than on the circumstances of its conception. The other women gave birth over the following months. Josephine delivered in September, a boy who looked more African than European, reducing some of the tension about whether the baby's appearance would make Thomas's position even more humiliating. Claire gave birth to twins in October, 2 more children added to the 2 she already had, overwhelming her with the responsibility of caring for 4 young children while still being expected to work full-time and still being at risk of continued rape by Beaumont. Estelle, Adeline, Celeste, and Pauline all delivered between October and December, each bringing a new life into slavery, each adding to Beaumont's wealth through the increase in his human property. Beaumont was pleased with the results of his breeding program. 7 successful pregnancies, 8 living children born, his enslaved workforce increased by a quarter in a single year. He calculated the future value of these children, the labor they would provide once they were old enough to work, the wealth they represented as property he could sell if needed. He began planning the next phase of his systematic breeding, determining which women would be included in the next year's program, thinking about whether he should continue focusing on the same 7 women, or rotate in some of the younger girls who were approaching childbearing age. His thoughts were entirely about economics and power, about maximizing his return on investment in his enslaved workforce, with no consideration for the human suffering his violence had created and was creating. The 7 women tried to recover from childbirth while also caring for newborn infants and returning to work as quickly as possible. Beaumont gave them minimal time to recover, a few weeks at most, before expecting them back at full work capacity. The physical toll was enormous, their bodies still healing from pregnancy and birth while being forced back into hard labor, their breasts engorged with milk for babies who were often taken away during work hours to be cared for by older children or elderly women too old for field work. The women were exhausted, depressed, traumatized, and still at risk of being raped again at any time. Marie struggled particularly with postpartum depression and the trauma of having given birth at 18 to a child conceived through rape. She loved Emily, but also sometimes felt resentment toward her, hated that looking at her daughter reminded her of Beaumont and what he had done. Marie felt guilty about these negative feelings, worried she was a bad mother for having complicated emotions about her child, tried to hide her struggles because showing psychological distress could be interpreted as weakness or defiance that might invite punishment. The older women who had experienced similar feelings after their own forced pregnancies tried to reassure Marie that her emotions were normal and understandable, that loving her child while hating how the child was conceived wasn't contradictory, but human. Josephine's marriage to Thomas never fully recovered. The birth of Beaumont's child permanently damaged their relationship, created a gulf between them that couldn't be bridged. Thomas tried to stay present, tried to be a father to Josephine's baby, even though he wasn't the biological father, but he couldn't overcome his rage and humiliation. Eventually, Thomas asked Beaumont's overseer to arrange for him to be sold to another plantation, wanting to escape the daily reminder of his powerlessness and his wife's violation. The overseer, recognizing that Thomas was becoming sullen and possibly rebellious, agreed. Thomas was sold away in early 1861, and Josephine lost both her marriage and her husband, left alone with a child who represented the violence that had destroyed her family. Claire, overwhelmed by the demands of caring for 4 young children, including newborn twins while working full-time and still being vulnerable to rape by Beaumont, began to experience what we would now recognize as a severe mental health crisis. She became unable to function, would sit and stare at nothing, would sometimes not respond when her children cried or needed her. The other women in the slave quarters took over caring for Claire's children, recognizing she was broken in ways that required community support. They also protected Claire from Beaumont's notice as much as possible, covered for her when her mental state made her unable to work effectively, tried to give her space to recover, even though recovery seemed nearly impossible under the ongoing trauma of slavery and sexual violence. Estelle responded to her forced pregnancy and birth with increased rage and defiance. She began to subtly resist plantation rules, would work slowly, would sometimes talk back to overseers in ways that drew punishment, but that asserted her humanity and her refusal to be completely broken. The other women worried that Estelle's defiance would get her killed, tried to counsel her to be more careful, but Estelle felt that maintaining some spark of resistance was necessary for her soul's survival, that being completely submissive would destroy something essential in her, even if defiance was dangerous. Adeline became even more withdrawn after her baby's birth, trying to become completely invisible, hoping that if she drew no attention, Beaumont might forget about her and move on to other victims. This strategy of invisibility was partly successful in that Beaumont did rape her less frequently after her baby was born, but it also isolated Adeline from community support, made her unable to accept help or connection because connection meant being visible. The other women understood Adeline's coping strategy, but worried about her increasing isolation and depression. Celeste, the cook, had more autonomy than most of the enslaved women because her position gave her necessary skills and some small power. She used this position to try to help the other pregnant and recently postpartum women, smuggling extra food to them, allowing them to rest in the kitchen when they were supposed to be working, providing what small protections her position allowed. Beaumont noticed Celeste's protectiveness of the other women and found it amusing rather than threatening, viewed it as the natural behavior of older women toward younger ones. didn't recognize it as the organized resistance and community building that it actually was. Pauline, the woman who had only recently arrived at Belmont before being swept into Beaumont's systematic rape program, struggled with being new to the community while going through such intense trauma. She didn't have the long-standing relationships and support networks that the other women had, didn't know who she could trust or rely on, felt isolated even within the community of victimized women. The other 6 women recognized Pauline's particular vulnerability and made efforts to include her, to extend support and solidarity, to help her integrate into the community that would be necessary for her survival. The babies born from Beaumont's systematic rape grew into toddlers, while Beaumont continued his violence against their mothers and began eyeing younger girls who were approaching childbearing age. The children were raised communally in many ways, cared for by whichever women had time and energy, fed by multiple mothers whose breasts all produced milk, taught and supervised by the whole community of enslaved women and children. This communal childcare was necessary because the biological mothers had to work and couldn't provide full-time care. But it also created strong community bonds, ensured that children who had been conceived through violence were still loved and cared for, gave the mothers some relief from the overwhelming demands of childcare under slavery. The mixed-race appearance of many of the children born from Beaumont's rapes created complicated dynamics. Some of the children looked more white than black, had Beaumont's features visible in their faces, carried physical evidence of their paternity that was impossible to deny. Other children looked more fully African, suggesting that their mother's genetics had dominated or that their mothers had been with other partners consensually before or during Beaumont's rapes. These variations in appearance affected how the children were treated, with lighter-skinned children sometimes receiving slightly better treatment or different work assignments, creating hierarchies within the enslaved community that white supremacy had imposed and that slavery enforced. The Civil War began in April 1861, just months after the last of the 7 women had given birth. Louisiana seceded from the Union, joined the Confederacy, and the war that would eventually end slavery had started. But in 1861, at the war's beginning, no one knew how it would end, and life on Belmont continued much as it had before. Beaumont continued to rape the women he owned, the plantation continued to operate, and the enslaved people continued to survive as best they could while waiting to see what the war would mean for their futures. The war disrupted plantation operations gradually over the next several years as men were conscripted into Confederate armies, as supply chains broke down, as Union forces advanced through Louisiana. Beaumont was exempted from military service as a large plantation owner, but many white overseers and small farmers who had helped manage Louisiana plantations were called to fight. This meant that plantations became increasingly difficult to control, that enslaved people had more opportunities for small acts of resistance, that the power dynamics that had kept slavery functioning began to shift slightly. Some enslaved men on Belmont began to disappear, running away toward Union lines where they could claim freedom, joining the Union Army when black soldiers were finally allowed to enlist, escaping when they could. The women, especially those with young children, had fewer opportunities to escape and faced greater dangers if they tried. Marie, Josephine, Claire, Estelle, Adeline, Celeste, and Pauline all stayed on Belmont through most of the war, caring for their children, supporting each other, surviving continued exploitation by Beaumont, waiting for liberation that seemed to approach slowly and uncertainly. The Emancipation Proclamation, announced in January 1863, declared enslaved people in Confederate territory free. But this freedom was theoretical until Union forces actually arrived to enforce it. For the women on Belmont, the proclamation meant hope, but not immediate change. They continued to be enslaved, continued to be raped, continued to work under the same brutal conditions, but now with the knowledge that the legal basis for their enslavement had been challenged, that the United States government had declared them free, even if Confederate Louisiana didn't recognize it. Union forces finally reached the area around Belmont in late 1863. When enslaved people began leaving the plantation, heading toward Union lines and freedom, Beaumont tried to prevent the exodus, threatened violence, attempted to maintain control even as his legal authority was collapsing. But the women, emboldened by the presence of Union soldiers and by the knowledge that slavery was ending, refused to stay. Marie, Josephine, Claire, Estelle, Adeline, Celeste, and Pauline gathered their children, left Belmont, and walked toward freedom together, a community of women who had survived systematic sexual violence and who were now claiming the liberty they had been denied their entire lives. Freedom was complicated and difficult. The women had no resources, no education except what they had gained through experience, no clear path forward. They ended up in a contraband camp, a settlement for formerly enslaved people under Union protection, living in crowded and unsanitary conditions, but living as free people for the first time in their lives. The physical conditions were harsh, but the psychological relief of no longer being owned, no longer being at risk of rape by Beaumont, no longer having to submit to his violence, was profound. The women stayed together as much as they could in freedom, maintaining the bonds that had been forged through shared trauma under slavery. They helped each other find work, care for children, navigate the confusing new world of nominal freedom that still included poverty and racism and limited opportunities. They told their children the truth about their conceptions as the children became old enough to understand, explained that they had been born from violence but were loved nonetheless. Helped them process the complicated legacy of having a rapist slaveholder as a father. Beaumont lost everything in the war and its aftermath. His plantation was confiscated, his enslaved people freed, his wealth evaporated. He died in 1868, bitter and broke, believing he had been wronged, never acknowledging the evil he had committed or the lives he had destroyed. None of the women or children he had victimized attended his funeral or marked his passing, except with relief that he was finally gone. The 7 women lived into old age with varying degrees of success in freedom. Marie became a domestic worker, never married, raised Amélie alone, and died in 1895 at age 53. Josephine remarried after Thomas's death, had more children in freedom, became active in her church, and died in 1901 at age 63. Claire never fully recovered mentally from her trauma, required care from her children and community for most of her life, and died in 1885 at age 50. Estelle's defiance served her well in freedom. She became a community organizer and advocate for formerly enslaved people, and died in 1905 at age 72. Adeline remained withdrawn and isolated, dying young in 1877 at age 46. Celeste used her cooking skills to establish a small business, achieved some economic security, and died in 1910 at age 80. Pauline moved west after the war, seeking distance from the site of her trauma, and lost contact with the other women, her fate unknown. The children born from Beaumont's systematic rapes grew up in freedom, carried their complicated legacies, and built lives marked by their origins, but not defined by them. Some achieved education and success. Others struggled with poverty and racism that persisted after slavery's legal end. All carried knowledge of how they had been conceived, of the systematic violence that had created them, of mothers who loved them despite the circumstances of their births. They passed this history to their own children, maintaining memory of what had happened even as official histories ignored or minimized the systematic sexual violence that had been fundamental to slavery. The story of Pierre Beaumont systematically raping and impregnating all 7 enslaved women of childbearing age on his Louisiana plantation in 1860 is not unique or exceptional. It's representative of patterns that occurred throughout slavery, where enslaved women's bodies were used for both sexual exploitation and forced reproduction, where masters raped the women they owned without consequence, where children were born from violence and added to the enslaved workforce, increasing masters' wealth through the commodification of rape. Understanding this story, facing its full horror without flinching, recognizing the systematic nature of sexual violence under slavery, is essential to understanding what slavery actually was and how it functioned. The women who survived, the children who were born, the community bonds that persisted despite trauma, all represent both the profound evil of slavery and the remarkable resilience of people who refused to be completely broken by it.